What if a prison could trap a person for years and the world forgot about them? There is a place in Illinois where the most dangerous criminals live in almost complete isolation. No friends, no freedom, no escape. The guards can watch everything, but even they fear what happens inside. One day, a shocking event changed the prison forever. After that, life inside became something almost impossible to imagine. This is USP Marion, the prison that turned isolation into a weapon. Imagine a place so secure, so isolated, that the world outside simply forgets you exist. A place where years feel like centuries, and hope is just a memory. This isn't a dystopian novel. It's a real place in the heart of Illinois, a Supermax prison that redefined the very meaning of incarceration. Welcome to the story of USP Marion, the prison that turned isolation into a weapon. Before Alcatraz closed its doors in 1963, the federal prison system needed a new fortress, a place to house the worst of the worst. That's when USP Marion was born. Opened in 1963, it was designed to be the nation's most secure penitentiary. For its first 15 years, Marion operated much like any other maximum security prison. It housed some of the most infamous criminals in American history, from mob bosses to serial killers. The inmates had routines, they interacted, they had a semblance of a life, albeit a confined one. But under the surface, a dangerous and volatile culture was brewing. The mix of high-risk offenders created a powder keg of tension, and the authorities knew it was only a matter of time before something ignited. That ignition point arrived in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A wave of violence swept through Marion. Inmate-on-inmate attacks became frequent and brutal. More alarmingly, assaults on staff skyrocketed. The prison was spiraling out of control. The traditional methods of discipline were failing. The administration was facing a crisis. How do you control the uncontrollable? How do you manage inmates who have nothing left to lose? They needed a new strategy, something radical. They decided to experiment with a concept that would change the face of corrections forever: the control unit. This control unit was a prison within a prison. Inmates deemed too dangerous for the general population were moved into this special block. Here, they spent 23 hours a day locked in their cells. Meals were pushed through a slot in the door. They had 1 hour of solitary recreation in a small, caged yard. Human contact was almost completely eliminated. This wasn't just punishment. It was a psychological experiment in sensory deprivation. The goal was to break the will of the most defiant inmates. But instead of quelling the violence, it seemed to fester, concentrating the prison's most volatile elements into one supercharged environment. The breaking point came on October 22, 1983. It's a date seared into the memory of the American prison system. In two separate, unconnected incidents on the same day, two correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were murdered by inmates. The prison was in shock. The nation was horrified. The response from the Bureau of Prisons was swift and absolute. The warden declared a state of emergency. The entire facility was placed on a permanent lockdown. This wasn't a temporary measure. This was a new beginning, or rather, a new kind of end for the inmates inside. The experimental control unit model was applied to the entire prison. Every single inmate at Marion was now subjected to 23-hour-a-day lockdown. The era of the Supermax had officially begun. Marion became the blueprint for a new generation of prisons designed around total and complete isolation. Life inside the new Marion was a living nightmare. Imagine your world shrinking to the size of a parking space. A concrete box, with a concrete slab for a bed, a toilet, and a sink. That's it. No more communal dining. No more yard time with others. No more educational programs or workshop activities. The only human interaction was with guards during cell checks or when food was delivered through a slot. The silence was deafening, broken only by the clanging of steel doors, distant shouts, or the sounds of your own thoughts echoing in your head. Psychologically, the effects were devastating. Inmates began to show signs of severe mental distress. They talked to themselves, paced endlessly. Some descended into a state of psychosis. The lack of stimulation and human contact chipped away at their sanity, day by day, year by year. This wasn't just about preventing violence anymore. It was about systematically dismantling a person's mind. The prison that was built to contain the most dangerous criminals had become a danger to the criminals themselves. The guards weren't immune to the oppressive atmosphere. They worked in a state of constant high alert. They weren't just managing inmates, they were managing a ghost prison. Their interactions were minimal, often through layers of steel and plexiglass. They witnessed the psychological decay firsthand, and many described the environment as draining and dehumanizing for everyone involved. The fear was palpable. Even though the inmates were locked down, the potential for sudden, explosive violence was always there. The guards knew that a moment of inattention could be their last. The Marion model, known as the control unit model, was soon replicated across the country. ADX Florence in Colorado, often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, was built specifically based on Marion's design. The concept of using long-term solitary confinement as a primary tool of control spread throughout the federal and state systems. Human rights organizations and mental health experts began to raise alarms. They argued that this level of isolation was a form of psychological torture, a cruel and unusual punishment that violated basic human rights. Debates raged. Were these conditions necessary to ensure safety and security, or were they an inhumane overreaction? Proponents argued that for a small fraction of the prison population, those who commit murder and mayhem even while incarcerated, there was no other choice. They pointed to the dramatic drop in violence at Marion after the lockdown. Opponents countered with a mountain of evidence on the severe psychological damage, arguing that it made rehabilitation impossible and often made inmates even more dangerous and unstable upon their eventual, though rare, release. After 2 decades as America's first Supermax, the story of Marion took another turn. By the early 2000s, with newer facilities like ADX Florence taking on its role, the Bureau of Prisons decided to change Marion's mission. In 2006, it was downgraded from a Supermax to a medium-security facility. The concrete walls that had enforced total isolation were, in some cases, literally torn down. The prison was renovated, and a new reentry program was introduced, focused on preparing inmates for a return to society. The pendulum had swung back. Today, USP Marion is a completely different place. It houses a general population and operates with a focus on rehabilitation and education. The control units are gone. The suffocating silence has been replaced by the sounds of a functioning prison community. It's a symbol of the ever-evolving, often controversial, debate over punishment and rehabilitation in America. The legacy of USP Marion is complex. It was a place born from a need for control, a place that responded to violence with an extreme and unprecedented form of isolation. It became a laboratory for a correctional philosophy that prioritized security above all else, raising profound questions about the price of safety and the limits of humane treatment. The story of Marion is a chilling reminder of what can happen when we push the boundaries of punishment and how a place designed to hold people can end up trapping them in a world worse than they or we could ever imagine. The air inside Marion had already grown heavy with tension by 1983. The walls seemed quieter, yet the weight of anticipation pressed on every cell, every corridor. The men inside, violent criminals and gang leaders, had learned the rules, had tested boundaries, and had endured months and years of strict routines. Yet even the most hardened inmates could not predict what would happen next. Every day carried a low hum of unease. Every sound, footsteps, a door clanging, a guard's voice, could be a warning. Some inmates whispered in the shadows about the upcoming changes, sensing that the prison itself was about to transform. On October 22, 1983, the transformation erupted into reality. 2 correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were killed in separate attacks. Klutz was stabbed during a routine shower escort. Hoffman was attacked hours later in a different part of the prison. Both men were experienced, respected, and careful, yet the violence found them anyway. The prison felt exposed, vulnerable, and alive with unpredictability. Fear spread quickly. Guards became hypervigilant, and inmates realized that even the most controlled environment could descend into chaos in seconds. The Federal Bureau of Prisons responded immediately. Marion entered permanent lockdown. Every inmate was confined to a single cell, 22 to 23 hours a day. Meals were slid through narrow slots and steel doors. Recreation yards disappeared. Any form of human contact vanished. Guards escorted prisoners in full restraints, handcuffs, leg irons, chains, and steel box shackles. Movements were timed, measured, and monitored. Silence pressed on every corridor. Every action, no matter how small, became significant. The prison was no longer merely a building. It was a machine of total control, testing endurance and resilience at every turn. Life inside the control units was brutal, subtle, and unrelenting. Concrete cells enclosed every inmate. Light stayed on almost continuously. There was no television, no radio, almost no sensory stimulation at all. Time lost meaning. The human mind began to invent its own stimuli. Imagined footsteps, phantom voices, shadows that shifted without cause. Some men adapted. They created routines, internal rituals, ways to mark the passage of time. Others broke under the pressure, whispering to themselves, hallucinating, or retreating inward completely. Every cell became a private battlefield of endurance and mental fortitude. Among those confined was Thomas Silverstein, whose name became a symbol of Marion's isolation. Already convicted of killing an officer, he spent decades in near-total solitary confinement. Meals, exercise, and minimal contact defined his existence. Yet even here, he exerted influence, inspiring fear and commanding attention. Other high-profile inmates, like Clayton Fountain and organized crime figures, also adapted to this extreme environment. Every day, every movement, every moment was a negotiation between human instinct and the prison's crushing control. Marion was no longer simply a prison. It was an experiment on the human psyche, revealing what isolation could do to the mind. Escape attempts, though less frequent after the lockdown, still occurred. Guards recalled inmates testing routines, exploiting small lapses, and attempting desperate measures. Each attempt reinforced the need for stricter protocols. Before 1983, communal areas allowed for alliances and confrontations, giving inmates opportunities for negotiation and subtle influence. After lockdown, every man was alone, and every decision carried amplified consequences. The prison transformed from a site of control to a living, psychological experiment where fear, patience, and observation became survival tools. Daily life in lockdown revealed subtle, haunting routines. Guards reported men walking in patterns, tapping fingers, or repeating phrases to mark time. Some whispered warnings or cryptic advice to new arrivals, passing knowledge about how to survive the monotony and silence. Others crafted small acts of defiance, blocking cameras with pieces of cloth, hiding contraband, or finding tiny ways to disrupt the rigid order. Even in total isolation, the human mind found ways to assert itself. Yet with every clever act, the prison adapted. Policies tightened. Movements became more regimented. The very walls of Marion seemed to learn and react, keeping the balance between total control and the unstoppable ingenuity of the men inside. The psychological toll was immense. Some inmates emerged stronger, resilient in ways unimaginable. Others vanished inside their own minds, shadows of people they had once been. Marion tested not just strength or obedience, but the limits of human endurance itself. The events of that day, the deaths of Klutz and Hoffman, had ignited a transformation that reshaped the prison forever. Every footstep, every shadow, every whispered rumor carried a weight, a sense that the walls themselves were alive with secrets, challenges, and dangers still unfolding. And even decades later, Marion remained a place where every story was layered with fear, resilience, and uncertainty, a world where survival was measured not just in years, but in the ability to endure the unseen pressures that no one outside could imagine. Even after the lockdown settled in, Marion's influence began to spread far beyond its walls. The lessons learned in Illinois would shape the federal prison system for decades. Officials studied the extreme control measures, the psychological impact on inmates, and the ways in which total isolation could prevent violence. Other high-security facilities began to adopt similar practices, a process later called Marionization. The prison had become not just a place of punishment, but a blueprint for containment on a national scale. One of the most notable transformations inspired by Marion was ADX Florence in Colorado. Built to hold the country's most dangerous inmates, it took the Marion model and amplified it. Concrete cells, constant surveillance, controlled movement, and extreme isolation became standard. Marion had proven that confinement alone could manage even the most violent men, but it also raised new questions. Was this level of control ethical? Could it prevent crime? or was it creating a new kind of mental harm? Experts and former staff debated these questions endlessly. Psychologists studied Marion's inmates and noted the toll of isolation. Reports documented anxiety, depression, and hallucinations in men confined for decades. Yet some inmates adapted in ways that shocked observers. They developed routines, internal strategies, and methods of coping that allowed them to survive. The prison became a laboratory of human resilience, showing both the fragility and the adaptability of the human mind. The early 2000s brought changes to Marion. Security levels were adjusted. Some aspects of the control unit were eased, allowing for limited contact and more structured programs. Yet parts of the prison remained as restrictive as ever. Marion continued to balance safety and control with the growing awareness of psychological harm. The lessons learned here influenced policies across the country, shaping modern high-security prisons and redefining the concept of Supermax confinement. Reflections from former guards, inmates, and experts reveal the complexity of life inside Marion. For some staff, the prison was a place where rules could protect everyone from the most dangerous men. For others, the isolation created ethical dilemmas, as the human cost of security became impossible to ignore. Inmates' stories, from small acts of resistance to long-term adaptation, highlighted both the ingenuity and the suffering of those confined. The prison had become a mirror, reflecting the extremes of human behavior and the consequences of total control. Marion's legacy is also one of caution. The practices developed here are still used in the United States, but they carry lessons for future generations. Extreme isolation can save lives by preventing violence, yet it can also erode humanity. The balance between safety and dignity, control and compassion, continues to challenge prison administrators, policymakers, and society as a whole. Marion's walls may contain criminals, but they also contain questions that remain unanswered. And so Marion exists today not just as a physical prison, but as a philosophical test. It asks what the limits of confinement can be and what the cost of maximum security truly is. The echoes of its corridors, the shadows of its cells, and the resilience and despair of its inmates remain a testament to both human endurance and vulnerability. The prison story is not finished. Every locked door, every shadowed corner, and every long hour of isolation continues to remind us that behind the walls, there are lessons, secrets, and consequences that the world has yet to fully understand. The questions remain: does extreme confinement protect society, or does it slowly erode the humanity of those within? Marion offers no easy answers, only the weight of its legacy and the haunting silence of its halls. The walls of Marion still stand, cold, silent, watching. They have held the most dangerous men in America, but they have also held secrets the world was never meant to know. Inside those concrete walls, power and punishment became one. Control became survival, and silence became a weapon. Every step echoes with stories of men who were broken and others who refused to break. Marion changed them. It changed America's prisons, and maybe it changed how we see justice itself. It forced the world to ask, how much control is too much? And when does safety become something else entirely? Marion's legacy is not just written in reports or files. It's written in the quiet minds that walked out different than they walked in. It's written in the walls that never forget, and in the silence that still lingers long after the doors close. If this story made you think, if it made you curious about what really happens behind those locked gates, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this video. Because the story of Marion isn't over. And what comes next will take you even deeper inside the world America was never meant to see.